Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You know, one common misconception about the case is that the civil suit ended following the arrest of Stephen for the disappearance of Teresa Holbach. That isn't actually what happened. True, Dennis Vogel and Thomas Kusurek were spared having to give their depositions. And of course, had that happened and then the case gone to the court, then that would have been an absolutely terrible outcome for Manitowoc Sheriff's Department. No, what actually happened was the $450,000 that was going to be paid by Mark Gundrum. The cheque had already been written out, and it was given to Dennis Vogel's insurance company. They took, the cheque was for $460,000 in fact, they took $60,000 and the other $400,000 was paid to Steve because the civil suit still had that small amount of value to it, apparently. Of course, the big problem was, it wasn't the amount of the money that was the problem, it was the fact that in accepting the $400,000, Steve had to accept that there was no wrongdoing by Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. And that is one of the big problems about this case, was the fact that the corruption was never exposed. Well, at least not until Making a Murderer came out. And now we know all of the things that happened with regard to that 85 case, for which the Sheriff's Department should have been made accountable for, but clearly weren't. And of course, when we look back at the 85 case, it's interesting that even the police department and people working in the DA's office were powerless to do anything about the obvious wrongful conviction of Steve. Who could they turn to? They couldn't turn to anybody. They were told by Thomas Kusurek, "We have our man." And incidentally, isn't it interesting, Thomas Kusurek has never apologised. Both he and Robert Herman used the term that the 85 case was unfortunate. Yes, it was very unfortunate for Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. Certainly when I first watched Making a Murderer, I was particularly outraged at the planting of the key, the bullet and the blood, and by Manitowoc Sheriff's Department. And I include the blood, although Kathleen Zellner is suggesting that that somebody else might have got into the Steve's trailer straight away and removed blood while it was still fresh. Remember, the police carry around with them distilled water. They can re-liquefy blood straight away, and that's often what they do. In order to get a sample of blood, they add distilled water and then swab it up. It didn't have to be done straight away. It could have been an hour later or more. And of course, it's interesting that we've got that still those pry bar marks on the door. I was particularly pleased when I saw those. That was particularly pleasing to see. So for me, the big outrage was Lenk and Colburn getting up and lying on the witness stand, because that undermines anybody's faith in law enforcement. Anybody and everybody's faith in law enforcement. Now, clearly, Andy Colburn was not involved in Teresa's disappearance, but definitely involved in the framing of Steve. There's no way that they would have included Andy Colburn in their plans for getting rid of Teresa Holbach, but certainly used him in order to frame Steve. And it's no big conspiracy. You don't need hundreds and hundreds of people involved. in order to carry this this frame job out. You don't need hundreds, you just need one or two of the important players to simply do their job, or certainly in the case of Andy Colburn, to do a very, very bad job of their supposed job, and to not write reports. So if you're going to write a report, make it late, years later preferably. The big issue with the coroner was that, of course, had she been allowed onto the salvage yard, she would have been a big problem, because she would have exposed the lack of investigation. What you have to remember with Deborah Kakach, and I'm sure some of you know about this, was that she she was sent to a road traffic accident where the victim had actually been run over by some sheriff's officers as they were arriving, and they were most distraught, and they tried to tell the coroner that she should write a report making sure that the victim was already dead before the sheriff's officers ran him over, and she was not prepared to do that, and this did cause huge problems. There was other things as well. She talks about the fact that she felt threatened going out at night, because of course often it was with sheriff's officers that she would have to go and act in her duty as coroner. So the first person I contacted regarding my sort of sense of outrage at making a murderer, the obvious choice was the sheriff of Manitowoc. Who else better to speak to than to him? And as I've mentioned on many occasions, he very graciously took my phone call and we chatted pleasantly. Even during our very first conversation, he said something very, very interesting. He said that I should come along and have a look and see how well everybody's getting on. And then he mentioned that he has no problem with Andy Colburn. And I was taken aback at that, because I didn't know that there was a problem until it was he that mentioned that Andy Colburn ran against him for sheriff back in '06. And he said that there is no problem. That was him, without any prompting from me, preempting what he thought was going to be a question from me, which I knew nothing about. I find that very odd, very curious. And of course, isn't it interesting that in that run to be sheriff, he was backed by Jim Link? Was that the trade-off for covering up the planting of the evidence? Well, you can draw your own conclusions, can't you? Why is it that a lowly sergeant suddenly feels like he could become the sheriff? Why would the top detective in Manitowoc want to back Andy Colburn? I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to work that one out. Another big problem I have with Andy Colburn: since when have evidence technicians been trained to be so rough with items of evidence, i.e. the bookcase, that he claims that he actually broke the back panel off the bookcase? Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. His claim that he was treating it roughly, no. Complete and utter nonsense. The Ricky Hochstetler case. Robert Herman drove round that night apparently with a piece of bumper. He was criticised for it. He was investigated twice to find out if it was he that either knew anything or was involved about it. Very odd. And of course, our Hoddit and Doddit, Lenk and Colburn, they were involved in fobbing off Debbie Hochstetler, even telling her that they'd called in specialists when they hadn't. And it was about 5 years later before any specialists came to look at the case. So, did Manitowoc Sheriff's Department cause Teresa's disappearance? We hear Dean and Jerry saying that, you know, clearly it wasn't Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, but they are sane lawyers. They are not going to go to the insane world of suggesting in court that that Manitowoc Sheriff's officers killed Teresa. No, they might have thought it, but they weren't going to say that. But Kathleen Zellner is now beginning to realise the corruption in Wisconsin. Remember, Sheriff Peterson, it would be easier to kill Steve than to frame him. Clearly, there is an assassination unit within the Sheriff Department, along with the evidence planting unit and lots of other units that Stacey commented on. Apparently next year, if the budget's high enough, they might even have an alien unit. I like that one. So, both the dude and the Aussie, they called me a sly git and one or two other things, because I managed to find out some information last night that Robert Herman will officially retire the first week of January. And I'm just wondering if, you know, now that he is abandoning ship, whether some of you would care to join me in sending the wonderful retired Sheriff of Manitowoc a wee message on his retirement, to point out that he'll still be in our minds. For me, this case has always been about Occam's razor. Occam's razor says that the simplest solution is always the right one. For me, it has always been the case that the disappearance, the timing of the disappearance of Teresa Holbach has always been too convenient for Manitowoc Sheriff's Department to be merely coincidence. Finally, some of you will know that I actually mentioned that John Farrack was bringing a book out about the case before it was publicly announced. Why? Because he told me about it, and I shared that with some of you. I've got my copy ordered. I must admit, at the time when John Farrack moved out of Wisconsin and working for the Post-Crescent, I was most disappointed, as a lot of us were. But the upshot of that has been that by moving back to Illinois, he has been so close to Kathleen Zellner that he had been going every week, at least once a week, to chat with her about the case and to find out, you know, what it's all about from her perspective. I suspect he's going to have a sensational book to read. Other books I would strongly recommend are obviously Sean Atwood's book, Unmaking a Murderer. The first 2/3 of Mike Griesbach's first book, very, very good if you want information about what happened in the 85 case. I've never been able to get hold of Chad Keller's book. The shipping across is particularly extortionate. But I feel that Chad has probably shared most of the information from his book with me. But for those of you who are in America, I would strongly advise checking out Chad's book. Who else has done a book? I think that's more or less covered them all. Certainly, as I say, I'm gonna look forward to getting John Farrack's book about the case. As I say, for me, there is no great conspiracy involving lots of people. Simply people doing their little part in the whole scheme of things. It only took one person up the food chain to come up with the plan. We've yet to find out who that was and how the plan was passed down the food chain. But for me, the timing of her disappearance is just too convenient. Anyway, I think that's all I've got time for today. Catch you again soon. Bye for now.